evening. My name is Catherine Pan Giordano. I'm a partner at Dorsey and Whitney. Dorsey is an international law firm with 19 offices around the world, including 3 in China. So we're glad to host you today in our office. I want to thank National Committee of U.S.-China Relations for organizing such a wonderful event. And I am appreciative of our speaker this evening, Mr. Philippe Le Corre, for bringing us such a timely topic. We all look forward to the discussion. So first, I would like to introduce to you Ms. Jen Barris, Vice President of the National Committee. So Jen has been with the National Committee since 1971.
Right.
Yes. So she's responsible, as you know, for everything. She's responsible for overseeing all program activities of the committee. This includes being actively involved in preparation and operation for the visits to the United States of hundreds of Chinese delegates, including the 1972 Chinese ping pong team, also including the most recent visit from Premier Li Keqiang. She also organized hundreds of delegations from US to China as well. At the request of the State Department, she coordinated Chinese press activities during Premier Deng Xiaoping's February 1979 visit to the United States. And she has been a leader at the National Committee for hosting major welcoming events for all the senior Chinese leaders. So let's welcome Jen Barris.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I appreciate that. I'm a little embarrassed. The evening is supposed to be about our wonderful speaker. He actually has a more interesting resume than I do, but I'm not going to waste your time talking about it because you have it in front of you. So we hope that you will look at that, and from it you will see the great breadth of experience that Philippe brings not just to our talk tonight, but to his research and his work on China, and the very interesting book that he and a co-author have written, and I will not want to fracture his co-author's name, Elaine Seplouk. I was telling Philippe before that my mother wanted me to study French and my father wanted me to study Latin, and I was whatever Daddy said, I did. Chinese is probably more, well, Latin was very useful too, but now I'm really sorry that I don't speak French. So at least your name is relatively easy to say. So we're really very grateful, as Catherine says, to have Philippe here this evening. He's talking about a subject that's not one that we often discuss here in the United States. We're so focused on US-China relations. I think it's really important to look at China's relations with the rest of the world as well. And Philippe does that very well in this book, which I urge you all to get a copy of if you don't know anything about China's relations with Europe, especially from 1985 until 2015. This is the book for you. And I must say I'm very impressed that Brookings got the book out so quickly, because it was published in 2016, and it's really quite up to date, so we highly recommend it. Philippe has a presentation with lots of very interesting slides that he's going to show us this evening. So rather than take any more of your time, I'm just going to turn it over to Philippe, and after he's finished, we will open it up to questions from the audience.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, it's very impressive hearing your background, John, so I feel humiliated and having heard that. But anyway, let me stand so that I can move the... So I'm very honored to be addressing the committee, and thank you very much, Jan, and everybody, and Margot for having me today. Following up some very impressive speakers. I've been watching some of the previous speakers in the series. And this is also part of some kind of book tour, which I'm doing in different cities, in Houston, Dallas, Brussels, and also on Harvard campus in early November. The book is primarily about investments, about Chinese investment in Europe. But I've also got a rather hopefully lengthy paper coming out very soon with my colleague Jonathan Pollack of the Brookings Institution, which is entitled China's Global Rise, Can the EU and the US Develop a Coordinated Policy? Sorry, there must be some. So I'm going to focus more on perhaps I should switch that off. Maybe there's two microphones on. Right. Yeah. So the book is an overview of both Sino-European relations on a macro level, as well as of the strategies of Chinese companies in Europe. But I'm going to focus more on part one, if I may say, because I think, first of all, it's more related to the series. And also, you know, I'm quite happy to answer any questions on management aspects and the, what Chinese companies are doing in Europe precisely. So the first question, you know, people ask me, and in fact, our host has been asking me the same question earlier, is why offensive? Why use such a military term? And you know, isn't it unfair to the Chinese? Now, obviously, we are talking about a country which is now rather, I mean, powerful in almost every part of the world, it's just a way to express assertiveness, I suppose. And there's actually one figure that came out today from the Chinese themselves. Pew Research has, you know, they have wonderful surveys on what people think about countries in particular. And they came out with this survey, in fact, today. And one of the figures released is 75% of the Chinese think that their country is playing a more important role in world affairs, actually more important than 10 years ago. So it's actually not just me saying that China is offensive. You know, it's become a sort of a worldwide knowledge. 15 years ago, China was a sort of medium-sized power, and today it is a world power. And in the case of Europe, as we will see, it has a presence now, which is mainly economic, but also in the field of soft power. And somewhat political. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to look at a number of issues in the next 30 minutes to describe China's relations with Europe, how it has grown over the past 15 years in particular, and how it is significant to the United States and to the rest of the world, which is basically the topic of my upcoming paper, which you will easily find on the Brookings website. So, you know, the problem with Europe, you're talking about the European Union as well as the 28 nations that are members of the European Union. But if you take the EU as a whole, as an economic entity, it is, I mean, China's first or second economic partner. Trade is growing. EU imports from China are, you know, as massive as they are here. In many ways, it has been mainly a trade topic. I mean, the Sino-European relation has been mainly about trade. as you can see, the trade flow, I mean, obviously, the deficit is in China's favor. But it is actually, it depends country by country. You would come up with different figures. There are, a number of EU concerns, obviously, from the Brussels institutions' point of view. First of all, you hear very frequently about the access to the Chinese market and the fact that the reciprocity doesn't always doesn't work as well as it was, and obviously the Chinese rise in economic terms is not always well taken in Europe. I mean, it's old Europe afterwards, the old continent. So I mean, any newcomer would be received with a certain degree of suspicion. But one problem, of course, is the third point about the state-owned enterprises who have been getting state subsidies. And in fact, there's one figure which you will find in the book. 70% of Chinese investments in Europe are actually from the state sector. The reason is, of course, the Chinese sovereign funds as well as the state banks that are actually supporting many Chinese companies, whether they are state companies or government-backed companies, and occasionally private companies as well. But the system is not as transparent as it would be in many other parts of the world. Looking at foreign direct investments, as you can see, it's now about 23 billion US dollars in 2015. We'll go into details, and I'll sort of look at several countries individually so that you get the big picture as well as some individual stories. But it's pretty much everywhere really, and the three largest European economies, Germany, France, and the UK, are of course prime targets, but also Italy and Greece and Portugal, two or three countries I will also address. And the book sort of doesn't cover every member of the EU, but certainly the countries which I'm going to talk about today, as well as we look at the sectors as well. So heavy industries, real estate, of course, and some other sectors. I will talk about later. So it basically started in 2008 with the Euro debt crisis. Of course, there were a few Chinese trade offices as well as partnerships. It started very, very slowly in the beginning of the year 2000s. But the 2008 debt crisis, which was a bit of a shock really in the aftermath of the Lehman Brothers, we're in New York, so I have to be careful not to criticize the financial sector.
Go ahead.
Although it seems to be well accepted now. Anyway, I mean, Europe was one of the victims, and I guess the United States as well. So China, basically, Prime Minister Wen Jiabao actually got in touch with the President of the European Commission. To his surprise, he told me the story and said, well, Premier Wen just called me, and he said, well, I'm happy to help, and we are, through our sovereign funds, we're happy to provide some funding for some of the countries that have suffered mostly from the debt crisis. And of course, one of the countries is Greece, a country that's been in the news very often for some sad reasons, but mainly because of the poor management of the Greek government. Which explains why Greece, which is only 1% of Europe's GDP, is now one of the main recipients of Chinese foreign direct investments. I have to point out also that China's presence in Europe is part of a more global policy, the going out policy. 周处区, which is the sort of going out policy of the Chinese, which was launched by Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin in the early 90s. And of course, it was basically about let's get out of China and you know, let's have our state-owned enterprises going abroad as well as our private companies. So I'm going to talk about One Belt, One Road at the end of this presentation, but just a quick look at the prime recipients of this Chinese FDI. The United Kingdom, which of course is a very interesting case with the recent referendum on the EU, Italy, France, Germany, Portugal, and the others are not that significant. But we'll come to this in a moment. It's increasing vastly for the past few years. You know, it went from 17 billion to 23 billion between you know, 2014 and 2015. It's a mixture of M&A as well as greenfield investments, but it's more about M&A and those sort of government-supported projects. But, important point, the cumulative overseas foreign direct investment from China is only about 4% of the total. So that makes the point to my critics who say that it's not an offensive yet. But you know, the Chinese take their time, and they are sort of building positions, and particularly in some of the weaker spots, perhaps, of Europe. And Europe has many economic problems, so it does make sense for China, which is one of the few cash-rich countries, in today's words, to play a role in the EU. A very quick look at some of the deals. I mean, there have been more since. I mean, Pirelli is this famous tire manufacturer, but in fact, ChemChina, which is one of the most aggressive Chinese investors, has also bought Syngenta, this huge, you know, agri-business company, which is based not in the EU but in Switzerland, and it's been approved by the US regulatory authority. So it looks like it's going to go ahead, and we're talking about over $30 billion. So that, you know, it's becoming quite significant. Just like the United States, the EU has been trying to talk to the Chinese about a bilateral investment treaty, which is called a comprehensive agreement on investments. And it was announced, the the start of the talks was announced in November 2014. But it hasn't really, it's really far from being completed. I'll come back to that in a moment. And it's just part of a big picture, really, is of China talking to Europe. In many ways, in 2004, China thought, you know, Europe was going to become the United States of Europe. But you know, with the enlargement, 12 new countries joining the EU, and a union of 28 members, that was a partner that China would be able to talk to. Of significant political and economic dimension. Now, of course, we all know that the story is actually a sad one, with not just, I mean, Greece, which almost left the EU last year, but also the United Kingdom, one of the top, you know, economies in the EU, which has now decided through a referendum to leave the union, and will probably do so in the next 2 years. So that will actually bring an interesting thinking into the Sino-European relationship. So very quickly, I'll go through a few countries. Now, Germany, of course, is the largest European economy. It is one of the prime recipients of Chinese investment. It is a priority also in the sense that Chancellor Merkel is really very much seen as the leader of Europe by the Chinese leadership. It's, you know, Germany is the economic powerhouse. It has brands, technology, high tech. you know, a strong economic power as well as a sort of revived political power in Europe due to the sort of problems taking place in France and somewhat in the UK, especially the UK, which is now going to leave. Chancellor Merkel, of course, has been in power for almost 12 years, and she's been going to China every year. And she's a rather outspoken leader. So she does speak about a number of things which do not necessarily please the Chinese government. She does it in a rather discreet way, unlike the German federal president who was in China last year, and I think Fudan or Tongji University in Shanghai, I'm not sure which one. He actually made a speech quite, you know, which didn't please the leadership. But anyway, they say, well, he's only the president, you know, the power is actually in the hands of the Chancellor, so that's fine. France is an interesting case as well, in the sense that it was the first European, in fact, Western country to recognize the PRC in 1964. It was a sort of Gaullist gesture, you could say, and it helped a number of French state-owned companies, so there are similarities there, to move into the Chinese market, particularly in the nuclear energy and you know, engineering fields. But of course, these days we are talking of, you know, about a China that is has the capabilities to build pretty much everything by itself, including high-speed train and not quite nuclear plants, but although a couple of them have been built by China without foreign interference. So the problem now, of course, for France is the fact. Of course, there's a trade deficit much bigger than with Germany. I mean, Germany is about, you know, it's a slight surplus for Germany. In France, it's a deficit, and so the problem is how can France really stand out? You know, so there's the question of Africa, France's role in Africa, and there are still a number of fields where France stand out. Not just culture, but also with some of the know-how. Third, the UK. Now, obviously, I'm afraid to say there's not much of an industry left in the UK, but London is the world's top financial centre. And it's not surprising that when President Xi went to London last October, he announced that London was going to become the first international platform for the renminbi, and that it's been hosting a number of events, and all the Chinese banks have a branch in London, and then there've been a number. I mean, you've seen the figures earlier. I mean, the UK is the top recipient of FDI, and of course the Prime Minister Cameron and his finance minister George Osborne, all gone now, were instrumental in driving this Sino-British partnership. Chancellor Osborne went all the way to Xinjiang and declared, you know, Britain was going to become the top destination for One Belt One Road, and that, you know, there's going to be a golden era and all kinds of things. And one aspect of this was the launch of the AIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, just about a year ago, where of course London was the first European country to become a founding member of the AIB, to the chagrin of Washington and especially someone I won't name in the White House, who accused London of constant accommodation towards China. All this sadly ended up in, I wouldn't say in disarray, but at least in question after the referendum last June, with a new Prime Minister who is a former Home Secretary, which means she was in charge of police and security, who doesn't seem to have the same opinions than her predecessor. And on top of this, of course, China, which is a very pragmatic, opportunistic country, rightly so, wanted to use the UK as a stepping stone for the rest of Europe, and use London, use Britain as a point of access to the wider European consumer market. At the end of the day, the story of Europe and China is a lot about selling Chinese products to Europe. One Belt, One Road, even though it's mainly about infrastructures and investments, the final objective is more about selling Chinese products. We all know that there's an issue with overcapacity for coal, steel, and other types of products, and the fact that China needs markets to have its economy, growing, continuing to grow. Sorry. Anyway, I've covered this, but perhaps the most important fact is to note Theresa May did interrupt the negotiations over the Hinkley Point deal. Hinkley Point is this nuclear plant which is partly financed by China through the state-owned Chinese nuclear corporation, and asked for time before finally making a decision. And but what we don't know is, will there be other nuclear plants afterwards? And we don't hear too much about the northern Powerhouse anymore, which is the north of England, this region which the previous British government was hoping China will help to build free of charge. Well, that's not the Chinese way. Greece, very briefly, very interesting. The harbour of Piraeus, very old harbour, very old Greece as well, was on sale, or at least had a concession to offer. And Costco, which is, I guess, the world's largest shipping company, and of course a famous Chinese state-owned enterprise, managed to acquire a concession for 2 terminals out of 6. And it worked pretty well. I take this as a very successful case of a well-managed non-Chinese entity run by a Chinese state-owned enterprise. And they've taken great care of this. And Costco is actually one of the most international-minded state-owned enterprises. Many of them actually, have a hard time. And there are many. We have many cases in this book about projects that failed for problems of miscommunication. Really, it's all about miscommunication usually. But anyway, Greece is of course a very interesting dimension, part of the One Belt, One Road, the New Silk Road, the Maritime Silk Road initiative. And in April of this year, Costco was given the full management of Piraeus after, same story as Hinkley Point and Prime Minister May. Syriza, the government, the newly elected government of Greece, left-wing government elected in January 2015, decided to halt the privatization of the harbour. One reason, of course, the government of Syriza was elected with the help of the Greek unions, and they didn't want to have Chinese bosses, bossing them around, and they wanted to have to keep their rights, their advantage as Greek workers. So it took another year of negotiations, and I think the price that was actually paid by Costco was higher than the market price, and also it's a relatively successful case, as I said earlier, of a Chinese-run project, Piraeus Harbour. One word on Portugal, another country that badly needs cash, and that has been selling some of its infrastructures and utilities to Chinese companies. Mainly state-owned, but there's also Fosun Group from Shanghai. But the Three Gorges Corporation has now 21% of the electricity company of Portugal. It's not insignificant. There's a story about golden visas that have been acquired by some Chinese investors, including in real estate. That's creating a bit of a debate, you know, in some of these southern European countries, whether, you know, a real estate investor should be acquiring a visa, you know, when he invests $1 million. I have to say, having spoken to Portuguese officials, some of them are having second thoughts about selling their infrastructures to China. It's creating a debate. I mean, you know, these are democratically elected governments and people having debates. That's what democracy is about. And the media and the political elites and just like when President Xi visited London, I don't think this was particularly well handled by the British side, by the way. The British elite started debating about having more or less Chinese investments. Central and Eastern Europe is a very special case, and of course I'm not going to go through the 28 European nations, but obviously there's something called the 16+1 mechanism, which was set up by both China and the 16 countries, which some of them are members of the EU, some are not, like Serbia. And it's basically about, it's a talking shop really that meets once a year, usually in Europe, but the last time was in Suzhou in China. And you know, basically the Eastern European leaders have been saying, look, we don't get an opportunity to speak to the Chinese president or the Chinese prime minister, not like the German Chancellor or the French president. So the problem is, of course, you know, China wanted to have one also with Southern Europe. With Nordic countries, and you know, so you know, occasionally I sit in conferences, and some of my Chinese colleagues sort of try me on this and say, well, you know, what about doing one with Europe, with Southern Europe? I said, well, you know, there's something called the European Union that actually works quite well, even though it's so heavily criticized. So perhaps it might not be a good idea to split the EU even more. I'm going to go through this very quickly because it's a very long presentation, and I'm conscious of the time. But there are basically 60 dialogues, yearly dialogues between China and the EU. You know, about climate, about energy, about education, science. It's actually a very deep relationship, and the EU does play a role as a unifying entity, which, you know, obviously every individual country at the end of the day is mainly interested in its own affairs. Now, on security, of course, you can imagine that is not the most favorite subject of the Chinese government, especially when it comes to the South China Sea. The Chinese government is probably, you know, asking, why on earth is Europe interested in the South China Sea? Well, there's one element of that. It's called a rules-based international order, and the fact that there's an international law and maritime law, and that it should be respected. And of course, the South China Sea is an area where most shipping companies have to go through, and where a lot of trade is being conducted. So, you know, there is an interest for European countries, as well as, of course, the United States and others, even though the European military presence is extremely limited. So there have been a number of statements from Brussels, mainly from Brussels, interestingly. That's where I think the European concept is somewhat working better than in other fields, like the economic fields, where people are basically competing for a share of the Chinese market or of the share of Chinese investments. That's basically what's going on these days. The South China Sea is becoming a bit of an issue, especially the International Arbitrary Court is of course based in the Netherlands, but and most of the judges were European, but they were independent judges. So. Right, I'm reaching the end of this presentation, but I wanted to perhaps as a conclusion to show you this map. I'm sorry, it's not very clear, but I'm sure you can see what I'm talking about. I mean, Harbour is still a fairly vague concept, but clearly, it doesn't include the United States. You can see that. Africa is a fairly interesting place that will, of course, be part of the maritime Silk Road. But the most sophisticated part, at least on this map, which is produced by a German institute on Chinese affairs, is Central Asia. The Caucasus and Eastern Europe. Now, we don't know what the final destination of Harbour will be, but one thing for sure is that Europe, with a 500 million consumer market, is highly interesting to China. And the Chinese economy, as we know, have been slowing down. And it needs to find other venues. And China these days has, very impressive multinationals that want to become even more global. Perhaps I should say a few words about transatlantic relations on China, because that's what my next paper is about. But the question is, can Europe detach? Can China detach Europe from its economic and political relationship with the United States? I think it's a critical issue that we're asking in our next paper, because at the end of the day, Europeans are committed to a rules-based international order, as we saw for the South China Sea and for the law on non-governmental organizations and so on and so forth. So of course, if you take country by country, I mean, it's sometimes a bit disorganized, as you could see for the AIIB, and the fact that Prime Minister Cameron took the initiative to sign in for AIIB without talking to his colleagues. That's slightly messy, but that's Cameron, and he's gone now, as I said. My own feeling is that there is actually a better coordination now, and certainly the recent wave of Chinese FDI has led a number of European governments to think that perhaps they have to be careful about certain Chinese investments in utilities, and there's a security dimension. Of course, data is one of the main factors. But having nuclear plants or high-speed train networks run by Chinese companies might be something to consider when you're looking for investors. One aspect, talking about Germany, I was referring to Pew Research earlier. Germany is China's strongest economic partner and possibly strongest European partner as a whole. It's also the least favorable country to China, if you look at Pew. It's 28%. I mean, some countries have over 50% of favorable opinions on China. And the main reason is about human rights, perhaps the NGO law, about different aspects. But in the most recent survey, the one I was talking about earlier, that just came out today, in fact, it's the economic dimension that is now worrying a number of Germans. So, of course, we haven't spoken too much about soft power, but I know Jan wants to ask me about this. And of course, in addition to this, China has been investing a lot in soft power, in culture, in the media. It's not just economic. I mean, and of course, the military dimension in Europe is not obvious. In the One Belt One Road initiative, I can promise you that there will be a security dimension, because there's no way a country is going to invest billions of dollars without having security mechanisms. I can promise you this. But in Europe, of course, it's more about political links, it's about influence, including in Brussels, towards the European Union institutions, and it's a lot about soft power and influencing, which doesn't always work. If you look at the European Parliament vote on market economy status, which overwhelmingly rejected the decision to give China a market economic status, even though it's part of the WTO rule, but some compromise will be found. My advice, of course, if I may, is to have a better coordination between the US and Europe on China. That would prevent perhaps an AIB-type fiasco to happen again. And there are many issues where we can coordinate, and one of them, of course, being investment. There's an organization called the CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which we don't have in Europe. And last but not least, Kurt Campbell was one of your guests, and he's written a very good book on the Asian pivot. I mean, I like pulling his leg and asking him about the European pivot, and he said, well, I've been writing in my book that the pivot wasn't against Europeans, it was with the Europeans. So we'll see what happens if Mr. Campbell becomes a senior official in a few weeks. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Actually, I was just at a meeting this afternoon where Mr. Campbell reiterated that very question. He says it's unthinkable that anyone would think that the pivot is a pivot away from Europe, because every major thing the United States has done in terms of international issues has been with our, he didn't say brothers, but our longtime friends in Europe. I wanted, before I open it up for questions, I'm sorry, I see Catherine was standing right at the back. Oh, you are there, good, okay, Catherine, because I think while I thanked you for your very thoughtful introduction of me, I neglected to thank Dorsey and Whitney, which we must absolutely do, because we are very, very grateful to the law firm for its extraordinary support of the National Committee, not just in our 50th year by having all of our China and the World programs here, but also before that, and we hope in the future. We're very grateful to Catherine and all of her colleagues and partners at Dorsey for their very generous and thoughtful support of us and allowing us to use this wonderful room. We're very grateful to them. So let me open up for questions. We don't have a lot of time. I have a lot of questions, but we'll let you guys go first. So Bill, why don't you start? Please introduce yourselves and wait for the microphone so that we can get you on camera.
I'm Bill Armbruster, retired journalist. Great presentation, lots of questions. What has been the reaction in China to Brexit, both by the government and the media, the think tanks?
Well, it's very unusual for the Chinese president to go to a country and to say a few months before a general election or a referendum, a very critical referendum, to say, well, I would prefer a stronger UK within a stronger Europe, or a strong UK within a strong Europe. And he's not the only president who's done that, and who actually, sadly, sorry, I don't know why. There have been too many microphones. Anyway, so I think there was some disappointments really, because in fact very, very few people had imagined that the British people would reject the offer, which is to remain in the EU. And so of course there have been a number of commentaries in the Chinese press saying that the UK is a declining nation, and that it will in any case lose out by making this decision, that referenda are kind of irrelevant, and why on earth do countries organize a referenda? Overall, of course, things will work out eventually. I personally think that the UK will lose out from not being a member of the EU as a country, because it will have to reorganize its trade policy as well as its investment policy, as well as its diplomacy, pretty much everything really in the next few years. I'm going to be looking very closely at this Sino-British relationship, which is quite fascinating, because at the end of the day, there will be an independent country, so to speak, in Europe, a pretty sophisticated country, but with very little industry left, and with a 65 million consumer market, which is quite different from a 500 million consumer market. And China will be looking for opportunities. And in fact, there have been a number of acquisitions in the property sector for the past few months, which is not surprising. London is a booming market. As far as investing for, in these areas, in Northern England, in Wales, where Britain actually needs financial help, I'm not so sure, for the reasons that China will only invest in places where there'll be return on investment, which doesn't really make sense.
In that context, I had read in an article that came out just before the Brexit vote that said that the Chinese really look to the UK to be its bridge to the EU. And so in light of Brexit, who are the Chinese now turning to be, or don't they need that anymore? Are they perfectly capable? As you said, it's interesting, because that was one of the questions I was going to ask you. You touched on it in your talk. It sounds like they prefer to do, or at least the European countries prefer to have bilateral negotiations when it comes to economics, but on security or maybe social issues, it's the EU that takes over.
Exactly.
And
it's very interesting. In fact, the past few months have shown a kind of change of mood in Europe. It used to be the case where every individual country, and I think the AIB was kind of a turning point, as well as the state visit to the UK, when China was sort of doing it naturally as a very down-to-earth power, dealing individually with entities, and the UK was very much willing to do that, trying to play its cards, and certainly Cameron and Osborne made very clear that they wanted to be China's best Western friend. Now the problem in democracies, leaders change, and as I said, Prime Minister Theresa May is a very different politician. Perhaps not so much experience in economics, but experience in security. She was the Home Secretary for 6 years. And so her attitude, now of course, her decision to hold the Hinkley Point project was not well taken at all in China, as you can imagine. It was criticized in the Chinese media, and people started wondering what is going on, and so I mean, this plus the fact that the British decided to vote Brexit didn't really help Britain's case in China. So to answer your question, Jan, I think Germany is really obvious point of contact, as Germany is undoubtedly the strongest economic country in Europe, and has a certain aura in China through its brand, its Siemens, BMW, Mercedes. These brands are really fascinating to the Chinese, and it's this culture of engineers is actually more impressive to the Chinese than the culture of, I'm sorry, I'm in New York again, but of financial people, of bankers, even though bankers can be useful as well, especially when you need to make your currency more international, and when you're part of the international basket of currencies. So yeah, I mean it's going to be a mixture of Germany, perhaps France on certain aspects. France is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It does have a presence in Africa. It does have a stronger military than Germany's. And I would say the EU as a whole will remain also a partner on a number of sectors. But of course, the EU, you can argue that Germany is, perhaps the driver, in the EU.
Philippe, thank you very much for your talk. It was a very interesting presentation as well. I have about 6 questions. Oh, I'm Graham Majorhart. I work at American Express in corporate strategy.
But you can only ask one of your
Exactly. I was just going to say I'm only going to ask one, despite all the stars on my paper. I want to ask you, what framework should we use to understand the interaction of SOEs and private companies? You had a graph up there that said 69% of the value is coming from SOEs and the rest from private companies. But as we all know, private companies in China aren't really private when you look at a company like Huawei. So how should we go about understanding that?
Well, I mean, it's very clear. I mean, China has a very clear definition of a state-owned enterprise versus a private company. The problem is, we know that Costco is a state-owned enterprise. We know that the president of Costco is basically a Chinese official, probably a party member. There's no secret about this. It's part of the Chinese technostructure, and basically Europe is an interesting case versus United States, because in the US it's the other way around. It's 70% private, 30% state-owned. The interesting point in your question is about funding, financing. Now, where Brussels, the European Commission, has been critical of China, is on the sort of state aid that's been taking place with companies like Huawei, ZTE, and others in M&A operations. And just a few months ago in this country, we had the Anbong story, where eventually Anbong wasn't allowed to bid for or decided to step aside the Starwood's hotel group. But the reason really, there was a lack of transparency that led a number of players in this game to say, look, we don't know, what is Anbong, and we can't really do business with a group that doesn't have clear books and clear financing. Who is behind Anbong? So there's been a few cases. I mean, Huawei is perhaps more clearly identified, even though it's not a listed company. So that's part of the problem. When you have listed companies, of course, the accounts, all this, and the legal aspects are more clearly identified in the West. But I don't believe Huawei will ever be listed, nor would many private companies. By the way, Huawei is not an investor. I mean, they keep saying they're investing in Europe, but they are basically selling, and they are not really investing. But they say they're opening R&D centers and things like that. But it's not what I call an investment, acquiring a company or really employing Europeans, which is what people need. I mean, at the end of the day, I should have said that in a clearer way, perhaps, is that Europe has, just like many parts of the world, needs job creation, and what China could help is helping to grow the European economy or grow the American economy, and that would in a way lead to a closer partnership. Now you could argue that of course the Westerners benefited a lot from the Chinese market in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and it's time for the Chinese to benefit from this famous globalization, which we all despise. Yeah, I mean, the problem is that's why all these discussions about bilateral investment treaties, free trade agreements are very critical at the moment, and we are at the stage where, in fact, that's why I was saying more coordination is necessary, and also more coordination with China. No need no doubt about that.
Question
Gu Weijun. I would like to ask you to comment on the likelihood of a some kind of free trade zone between the EU and China in the next 10 years. Now, Switzerland has signed such a deal with China, and the former British Prime Minister, who has now left, once publicly advocated that the EU should accelerate the pace in negotiating with China in setting up such a mechanism. And what will be the likely impact now Britain is out of Europe of a faster movement on that front? And what are the forces in favor of driving these two blocks in that direction, and what are the forces against that, that eventuality, in your view?
A very short answer to that, so we have two more questions.
I think we're not there yet. The EU has established a free trade agreement with the Republic of Korea. I know China has been pushing very hard on this. I don't believe the moment is right, and for the reason that, for example, the market economy status situation has shown there are a lot of wariness about jobs, and we're talking about 200,000 industrial jobs at stake in Europe. Should there be, this market economy status, mainly on the steel industry and heavy industry dimensions? But I think China needs to be more integrated in the European economy to start. And also there's the problem of the market access in China, which has become, if you read reports from the European Chamber of Commerce or the American Chamber of Commerce, both of them say the same thing, that it's becoming more difficult to do business in China. Because the Chinese are just, they've become very good. They can do everything really, and they feel they should help their local champions. Now the problem is, of course, you can't have it both ways. I mean, so you either you open your market, or you don't have access to the others' markets.
There's a question. Do you still have a question?
Yeah.
Yes, down there.
Hi, Philippe. It's a great presentation. Thank you. My name is Fei. I come from ICBC, so Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. So certainly you touched base about Brexit. In my view, the EU economic development is still cloudy, with inflow of refugees, and also the Brussels monetary policy. And you also mentioned a lot about all the security parameters, EUs have concern. Maybe a forward-looking basis, how you think the China FDI will go in the EU zone, particularly for maybe any sector, maybe a critical mass in certain industries.
Well, I mean, I'm sure it will continue to grow, no doubt about this. The problem is, once again, is it going to be about M&A acquisitions of European brands? Is it going to be about job creation? Is it going to be about bringing growth and including job growth in Europe? One very important aspect, which I didn't have time to comment on, is the fact some of the acquisitions by Chinese companies in Germany in particular, and in Italy as well, have helped the European brands to sell their products in the Chinese market. So, for example, there's a company called Sani in Germany who acquired Putzmeister. And Putzmeister has been sort of relaunched in the Chinese market, where of course it was struggling. And you've got another example, of course, is Volvo, the Swedish car manufacturers, which was pretty much dying, and that has been helped by its Chinese owner called Geely, which is a car manufacturer from the east coast of China, and which is doing quite a good job, because I mean the Chinese market, of course, is one of the biggest automobile markets, but it's also a very competitive market. So for Volvo to have this Chinese owner has been a fairly positive story. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but my feeling is that with all the plans underway, especially with this, and Eastern Europe is somewhere to look at, as well as Southern Europe. Not so sure about sort of good old Europe, so to speak, France, Germany, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, these places, I mean, might be slightly more reluctant. But, you know, once again, things change, governments change. There's going to be more coordination, and also more coordination with the United States. Thanks.
Okay, one last question. Frank, a short one, please.
Frank Hale. China is going to do foreign direct investment in the United States and in Europe. Last summer, or actually last winter, Philips, the Dutch firm, was going to sell its Lumileds division to a Chinese entity. Even though neither country was based in the United States, CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, quashed the deal, and Philips has decided to go another route. So the question is, how do Europeans feel about this kind of intervention on the part of the United States, interfering in their deals? And second, will China attempt to circumvent the United States' increasingly security-oriented investment policy vis-a-vis China by dealing more with the Europeans?
Well, the case is in the book, first of all, the one you mentioned, the Philips case. And it is a problem, but it's not just related to China. I mean, American regulatory authorities do intervene on a number of international cases which have nothing to do with the United States, just because these multinationals happen to have activities in the United States. Interestingly, another case I was referring to, Syngenta, has been cleared by the US side. And you know, it is a very, very significant deal, because Syngenta is basically the top, you know, the world's top leader in this activity of seeds and you know, agro business. I don't know whether, I mean, obviously China has been talking to the Europeans for many years, and very often receiving a friendly ear about this sort of American interventionism, and the fact that Europeans can actually decide for themselves. But when it comes to markets and multinationals, unfortunately, there's nothing you can do about you know. And Philips doesn't want to damage its business presence in the United States, I suppose. So, but you know, there are all kinds of bilateral dialogues between China and Europe that do not go through Washington or New York. Let me emphasize this. And it's not going to stop. And of course, Kurt Campbell, our old friend, he was kind enough to organize a yearly a roundtable with a few Europeans, you know, to talk about what he was doing in the State Department. But that's really not enough. And so that's, you know, part of the equation is how to, you know, have a transatlantic dialogue on such an important factor as having a player like China in the world today, which is not redrafting the rules, but you know, sometimes when you talk about, you know, AIB and you know, the way international financing has been done and you know, code of conduct and things like that, it's going to be an interesting thing to look at. So that's the answer.
Okay, I'm sorry I let this go over a little longer, but I thought the last couple questions were really interesting. I'm glad, Philippe, you answered them and that you all stayed to listen. He is able to sign books if those of you who have bought them would like to come up. And thank you all for coming. Again, thank Dorsey and Whitney and Catherine Pon-Giordano and her colleagues here at Dorsey for once again providing a lovely home for us. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next